Hello. Welcome to our recorded lecture on David Schweickart's 2008 article titled Global Poverty, Alternative Perspectives on What We Should Do and Why. Very briefly, I'll summarize what we read in this article. Schweickart walks through two different moral arguments for solutions to global poverty. Those moral arguments use different moral frameworks to determine what the best and morally obligatory course of action is with regards to global poverty. From this analysis, Schweickart argues that the actual source or cause of global poverty has not been addressed in the proposed solutions he considers. In other words, the existing analyses of these moral philosophers that Schweickart considers in the first half of his article fail to address the cause of the problem they propose solutions to. And in the case of global poverty, the source or cause must be examined because we cannot solve the problem of global poverty if we ignore its cause. Schweikart's article is a good example of how moral reasoning is at work in our lives and involved in our attempts to understand moral problems and solutions. We'll be focusing on the moral argument structure Schweickart uses. He gives us a great example of logical analysis in thinking through complex problems and focusing on the relationship between ideals, and in this case, focusing on the relationship between ideas, and in this case, the ideas that are central to the problem at hand, i.e., global poverty. This article also demonstrates one specific way in which the moral dimension of our lives is intricately connected to a network of others and their actions. Schweickart argues that global poverty is the result of global capitalism, which we should understand is implicating all of us because we all have to participate in the economy we have. You may ask why we're reading this article. The simple answer is that this article is a perfect transition from Iris Marin-Young's article to Kwame Anthony Appiah's article. Schweikart's analysis of global poverty builds off of Young's concepts of structural injustice and political responsibility and leads us into Appiah's discussion of how future generations will judge our moral priorities today. It also is an exemplary instance of moral reasoning, i.e., using philosophical and logical moves to discuss a moral problem. In this case, the problem is of large-scale suffering, where arguably there need not be. In terms of its connections to Young's article, Schweickart gives us a concrete example of Young's concept of structural injustice. Recall that Young proposes we understand structural injustice as an injustice that cannot be traced to one individual or entity, whether we're talking government agency, corporation, or organization. While Schweickart does trace global poverty to one economic system, namely global capitalism, the economic system of global capitalism consists of hundreds of entities collectively responsible for maintaining that economic system. It also gives an example of an issue that calls for employing Young's concept of political responsibility. Changing the global economic structure and habits will not result from the action of one person or one nation's government, but will take collective action on a global scale. And next week, we'll read a brief Washington Post opinion article by Appiah titled, "What Will Future Generations Condemn Us For?" And in terms of connections to that article that you can look out for, Schweikart's article considers a particular global and moral problem that Appiah would likely say, yes, future generations will condemn us for this. And the this being allowing global poverty to persist when we have the material and economic means to end it. And in illustrating Appiah's point, Schweickart also demonstrates the practice of aiming our moral volitions forward in time, not simply in the present. In other words, one way to think morally is to think about the future, to imagine how we will justify our actions and values some years into the future. Moral thinking, now perhaps more than in past eras, includes the demand to think beyond the present, far into the future. Because of the long reach of the practices in technology and various multi-billion-dollar global companies, not only geographically but temporally, we need to consider the long-standing effects and impact of our technological and economic choices today. In Appiah's article, he discusses 3 signs or indicators that an issue or practice will likely be judged immoral in the future. On the 3rd sign, Appiah says that, quote, supporters engage in what one might call strategic ignorance. avoiding truths that might force them to face the evils in which they're complicit. Those who ate sugar or wore the cotton that the slaves grew simply didn't think about what made those goods possible. End quote. Appiah's point is that when we see this kind of strategic ignorance, we are seeing a sign that a future generation will condemn our generation for failing to act to solve a moral problem, despite plenty of knowledge of the problem and sufficient resources to solve the problem. This is particularly relevant when we ignore certain practices of companies that perpetuate poverty, such as sweatshop labor, child labor, prison labor, or companies that willfully pollute air and water or irresponsibly dispose of their waste, thereby doing long-term damage to a local environment. Knowledge and awareness aren't enough, but understanding that our cheap clothes and products are possible because of companies exploiting workers in other countries is one early step to being able to envision future generations' judgment of our current behavior. And it is worth pointing out that all three articles, Young's, Schweickart, and Appiah's, consider moral reasoning on a societal level. Schweikart's article shows why some standard approaches to global poverty fail. Specifically, he considers Peter Singer's and Thomas Pogge's approaches to global poverty, and finds that they both fail to consider the significance of causality, or fail to address the heart of the cause of global poverty. Schweickart then makes the argument that global capitalism is structurally inadequate to resolve global poverty because it requires unemployment. The solution, Schweickart argues, is an economic democracy. An economic democracy could resolve global poverty, Schweickart argues, because in such an economic system, folks would have a say in how resources are allocated, where companies get to build and develop, and where they can dump their waste, and what projects they can put money into, etc. A few words on Peter Singer and Thomas Pogge. Singer is an Australian moral philosopher known for being an ardent utilitarian. Pogge is a German social political philosopher and is rather Kantian in his ethics. Both are alive today and accepted as more or less authorities on the topics of ethics and politics. You may have already heard of them, though perhaps not. I am not going to spend time on a full introduction to them, but they're famous enough that if you take another philosophy class or political theory class, you very well may read their work. And so I did want to draw your attention to them as philosophers and thinkers in their own right, not merely as thinkers to be taken up in a philosophical article. Schweickart starts the article by pointing out an idea from Karl Marx, that problems appear solvable only once we acquire the means to resolve them. In Marx's words, quote, mankind inevitably sets itself only those tasks it is able to solve. The problem itself arises only when the material conditions for its solution are already present, or at least in the course of formation, end quote. Schweickart identifies global poverty as a problem of this nature. He says, quote, the urgent practical problem of global poverty has become a problem, as opposed to an inescapable part of the human condition, only because material conditions now exist for its eradication, end quote. In other words, the opening idea of the article is that problems only truly become problems once we have the means to address them. When we lack a way to solve a problem, it often appears inevitable or merely an unfortunate, inescapable part of human condition. Maybe Schweikart's idea here is not yet clear. So I'll add that in general, but very much so in philosophy, one thing that can help clarify a concept or idea is to try to think of some other phenomenon to compare the idea or concept to. In this case, let's compare poverty to health. So here's how I understand Schweikart's point. Poverty used to be understood as what could be called a sort of God's will phenomenon. In this sense, poverty is like polio. Prior to knowledge of how the polio virus was spread and prior to the emergence of effective treatments like the polio vaccine, getting polio was just an unfortunate possibility of nature, right? It was one of these inescapable parts of the human condition. Sometimes we get sick and we can't do anything about it. Some people get polio, some people don't. In the way that polio and other diseases were just a fact of life, they were not, quote unquote, a problem, right? Understanding a problem as something that has a possible solution. So when an unfortunate phenomenon lacks a possible solution, it's not really a problem so much as a total bummer. And once we expand our knowledge through research and develops treatments, the sort of fact of life changes into a problem that can and should be solved. Global poverty is like someone getting polio when the vaccine exists. Only once a problem has an imaginable solution does it rise to the surface of moral thinking. If we really can't do anything about a kind of suffering, we don't tend to see it as a moral problem. The benefit of this introduction on the part of Schweickart is that it shows how some moral problems really are unique to a time. In ethics, we have historically focused on individual morality. Again, think in terms of Jung's liability model of responsibility. But with innovation and progress, etc., as we solve some problems and overcome some injustices, we also realize and even create new problems.